February 19, 1945. The dawn sky over the Pacific was blood red, as if nature itself was warning of the carnage about to unfold on the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. The small island, just 8 square miles of sulfuric hell, had been transformed by Japanese engineers into the most formidable fortress in the Pacific. Every cave, every ridge, every square yard of volcanic rock had been turned into a killing field designed to bleed the American war machine dry. Standing on the bridge of the USS Mount McKinley, Colonel Franklin Ian Frank Hartman studied the smoking island through his binoculars. At 42, Hartman was already a legend among the Marines, a hard-charging officer who had earned his reputation in the brutal campaigns at Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Peleliu. His weathered face bore the scars of a dozen battles, and his steel-gray eyes held the kind of cold determination that made even veteran Marines step aside when he walked past. The orders from Washington were crystal clear: proceed with extreme caution, minimize casualties through overwhelming firepower, and conduct a methodical advance that could take months to complete. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, sitting in their comfortable offices thousands of miles from the sound of gunfire, had crafted a careful plan that prioritized preserving American lives over speed of conquest. But Hartman knew something the planners in Washington didn't understand. In war, hesitation killed more men than boldness ever could. He had watched too many good Marines die in prolonged campaigns, where caution had given the enemy time to strengthen their defenses and prepare for each predictable American move. Speed, he believed, was not just a tactic, it was a lifesaver. Preliminary bombardment of Iwo Jima had begun 3 days earlier, with the Navy unleashing the most concentrated firepower in Pacific War history. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had poured 22,000 shells into the island's 8 square miles, turning the landscape into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. From the air, waves of B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses had dropped thousands of tons of bombs on suspected Japanese positions. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, was confident that the bombardment had neutralized most Japanese resistance. Intelligence estimates suggested that the 3-day barrage had killed or wounded at least half of the island's 21,000 defenders. The landing, Spruance predicted, would be a walkover compared to previous Pacific campaigns. Hartman wasn't so optimistic. He had studied intelligence reports on Japanese defensive tactics and knew that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Iwo Jima's defense, was no ordinary enemy commander. Kuribayashi had spent months preparing his defenses, digging a network of tunnels and bunkers so extensive that American bombs and shells might as well have been raindrops on concrete. More importantly, Hartman understood that Iwo Jima wasn't just another island to be captured. It was the key to the entire Pacific campaign. The island's airfields would provide fighter escort for B-29 bombers attacking Japan, and emergency landing sites for crippled aircraft returning from raids. Every day that Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands meant more American airmen dying over the Japanese mainland. On the evening of February 18th, as Hartman reviewed the landing plans one final time, a coded message arrived from Marine Corps headquarters. In Washington, the orders were unambiguous: advance with extreme caution. Minimize casualties through overwhelming firepower support. Expect prolonged resistance requiring methodical reduction of enemy positions. Hartman read the message twice, then calmly tore it into pieces and dropped them into his wastebasket. His aide, Captain Robert Bobby Morrison, watched in stunned silence as his commanding officer destroyed direct orders from the highest levels of the military hierarchy. "Sir," Morrison stammered, "those are orders from Washington." Hartman turned to face his aide, his expression granite hard. "Bobby, I've been fighting this war for 3.5 years. I've seen what happens when we give the enemy time to prepare, time to dig in, time to turn every rock and tree into a fortress. Speed saves lives. Caution kills Marines." Morrison had served under Hartman since Guadalcanal, and knew better than to argue with his commanding officer when he had that look in his eyes. But he also understood the implications of what Hartman was doing. Disobeying direct orders during wartime could result in court-martial imprisonment, or worse. The colonel was risking everything on his own judgment. "What are your orders, sir?" Morrison asked quietly. Hartman walked to his field desk and pulled out a hand-drawn map of Iwo Jima that he had been studying for weeks. The map was covered with notations in his careful handwritings, suspected enemy positions, possible approach routes, and key objectives that had to be secured quickly to ensure the success of the entire operation. "We're going to hit them fast and hard," Hartman said, pointing to the map. No cautious advances, no prolonged bombardments of individual positions. We'll land, establish a beachhead, and push inland immediately. Speed and aggression will be our weapons. The plan Hartmann outlined to his subordinate commanders that night was audacious beyond belief. Instead of the careful, methodical advance prescribed by Washington, he intended to launch a lightning assault that would carry his Marines across the island in days, rather than weeks. Key positions would be bypassed, rather than reduced, if it meant maintaining momentum. Risks would be accepted that would make staff officers in Washington wake up screaming. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Gaylor, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, listened to Hartmann's briefing with growing amazement. "Frank," he said finally, "this plan violates every principle of amphibious warfare. We'll be advancing without secure flanks, without adequate fire support, into terrain we haven't properly reconnoitered." Hartmann nodded grimly. "You're absolutely right, Bob. It violates every principle, except the most important one. Win quickly and bring our boys home alive." The conversation continued past midnight, with Hartmann's battalion commanders raising every conceivable objection to his plan. The risks were enormous. Advancing Marines could be cut off and surrounded. Supply lines could be severed, and casualties could mount catastrophically if the assault stalled in the middle of the island. But Hartmann had answers for every objection. Responses based on 3 years of combat experience that had taught him the difference between acceptable risks and reckless gambles. Speed would prevent the enemy from organizing effective counterattacks. Momentum would carry American forces through defensive positions before the Japanese could coordinate their response. Most importantly, the quick victory would save thousands of American lives that would be lost in a prolonged campaign. "Gentlemen," Hartmann concluded, "in 6 hours we're going to begin the most important battle of the Pacific War. We can fight it the way Washington wants, carefully, methodically, and expensively in American blood. Or we can fight it the way Marines fight, fast, hard, and with absolute determination to win. I know which way I'm going to fight it." The landing began at 0900 hours on February 19th. Just as the sun was burning through the morning haze that hung over Iwo Jima's beaches, the first wave of Marines hit the black volcanic sand, and immediately knew they were in for the fight of their lives. The island seemed deserted. No return fire greeted the landing craft. No machine gun bullets churned the surf around the Marines as they waded ashore. For 20 minutes, the landing proceeded almost peacefully. Marines established beach positions, unloaded equipment, and began their advance inland through the loose volcanic ash that made every step a struggle. Some optimistic souls began to hope that Admiral Spruance had been right. Maybe the 3-day bombardment really had broken Japanese resistance. Then the trap was sprung. At 0930 hours, Iwo Jima erupted in fire and steel as Japanese defenders opened fire from positions that had survived the massive bombardment. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces that had been carefully concealed in caves and bunkers began tearing apart the American landing force with devastating accuracy. The Marines, caught in the open on beaches that offered no cover, began taking casualties at a rate that shocked even veteran combat leaders. Within minutes, the black sand was stained red with American blood as Japanese fire swept the landing zones with mechanical precision. It was at this moment of crisis that Hartmann's decision to ignore Washington's orders proved its value. Instead of following the prescribed plan of establishing secure beachheads before advancing inland, Hartmann immediately ordered his Marines to push forward into the enemy fire. "The only safety is in movement," he radioed to his battalion commanders. "Get off the beach and get moving inland. Speed is life." The order seemed like madness to Marines who had been trained to establish secure positions before advancing. But Hartmann understood that the Japanese defensive plan depended on pinning American forces on the beaches, where concentrated fire could destroy them. By advancing immediately into the enemy positions, his Marines would disrupt Japanese plans and force them to fight the kind of close-quarters battle where American firepower and training advantages would be decisive. Lieutenant John Bradley, a Navy corpsman who would later become famous as one of the flag raisers on Mount Suribachi, later described Hartmann's tactics. "The colonel was everywhere, pushing us forward when every instinct told us to dig in and wait for support. He kept saying, 'Movement saves lives,' and somehow we believed him." The advance inland was a nightmare of confusion and violence. Marines struggled through volcanic ash that reached their ankles, making rapid movement impossible. Japanese defenders, fighting from prepared positions, took a terrible toll on the advancing Americans. But Hartmann's strategy was working by refusing to become pinned down on the beaches. His Marines were forcing the Japanese to fight on American terms. By noon, on D-Day, Hartmann's forces had advanced further inland than any unit in the entire landing force. His aggressive tactics had carried them across the first ridgeline and into positions where they could support the landing of follow-in waves. The cost had been high, nearly 200 casualties in the first 3 hours, but the results were undeniable. More importantly, Hartmann's rapid advance had identified weaknesses in Japanese defenses that could be exploited by other units. His Marines had discovered that the enemy's positions were not mutually supporting. Aggressive assault could break through defensive lines that appeared impregnable from a distance. The radio messages flying between Hartmann's command post and higher headquarters grew increasingly heated as the day progressed. Naval commanders, watching the casualty reports mount, demanded that Hartmann halt his advance and wait for additional fire support. Marine Corps headquarters repeated the original orders to proceed with caution and avoid unnecessary risks. Response was typically direct: "We're winning. Don't stop us now." The second day of the battle proved the wisdom of Hartmann's approach. While other units struggled to advance beyond their DAD objectives, Hartmann's Marines had fought their way to the base of Mount Suribachi, the 550-foot volcanic peak that dominated the southern end of the island. The rapid advance had prevented Japanese defenders from organizing the kind of coordinated resistance that could have stopped the American assault. But the fight for Suribachi would test Hartmann's philosophy of speed and aggression to its limits. The mountain was honeycombed with caves and tunnels that had been blasted from the volcanic rock by Japanese engineers working for months. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire from machine guns and mortar positioned in positions that American bombardment couldn't reach. Traditional military doctrine called for a careful reduction of the mountain's defenses, using overwhelming firepower to neutralize enemy positions one by one. The process could take weeks and would require enormous expenditures of ammunition and aircraft sorties. Washington's plan allocated 2 weeks for the capture of Mount Suribachi alone. Hartmann allocated 2 days. The assault on Mount Suribachi began before dawn on February 21st, with Marines advancing up the steep slopes under cover of darkness. The climb was treacherous. Loose volcanic rock made every step hazardous, and Japanese defenders had carefully prepared ambush positions along all the likely approach routes. But Hartmann's Marines had learned to use speed and surprise as their primary weapons. Instead of advancing along predictable routes, they climbed the steepest faces of the mountain, where Japanese defenses were lightest. They moved in small groups that could respond quickly to enemy fire, without exposing large numbers of men to concentrated attacks. The fighting on Suribachi was some of the most brutal of the Pacific War. Marines and Japanese soldiers fought hand-to-hand, in caves and tunnels where rifle fire could kill friend as easily as foe. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice for clearing enemy positions, but their use required getting within yards of Japanese machine gun nests. Private First Class Ira Hayes, one of the Marines who would later help raise the flag on summit, remembered the assault. "The colonel was right there with us, climbing the same rocks, breathing the same smoke. When we wanted to stop and rest, he kept us moving. Don't give them time to think," he'd say. "Keep them guessing where we'll hit next." By the evening of February 22nd, Hartmann's Marines had fought their way to within 50 yards of summit. The final assault would require a frontal attack across open ground against enemy positions that commanded every approach. It was the kind of attack that military textbooks said was impossible without prohibitive casualties. Hartmann decided to make the attack anyway. The final assault on Mount Suribachi began at 0800 hours on February 23rd, with a 40-man patrol led by Lieutenant Harold Schreier climbing toward the summit. The Marines expected fierce resistance from Japanese defenders, who had held the mountain for 3 days, against overwhelming American firepower. Instead, they found that Hartmann's relentless pressure had finally broken Japanese resistance. The enemy positions that had seemed impregnable were either abandoned or defended by small groups of survivors, who were quickly overwhelmed by American firepower. By 10:20 hours, American Marines stood on the summit of Mount Suribachi, looking out over an island that was supposed to have taken months to capture. The flag raising that followed became one of the most famous images in American history. But for Hartmann, it was simply confirmation that speed and aggression could overcome any defensive position. Mount Suribachi, which was supposed to require 2 weeks of careful siege warfare to capture, had fallen in 4 days of continuous assault. The psychological impact of Suribachi's capture was enormous. Japanese defenders throughout the island could see American flags flying from the mountain that was supposed to be their most secure position. More importantly, American forces now controlled the high ground that commanded the southern approaches to the island's airfields. But Hartmann knew that capturing Mount Suribachi was only the beginning. The real test would come in the assault on the island's northern defenses, where General Kuribayashi had concentrated his best troops and most sophisticated fortifications. This was where the battle for Iwo Jima would be won or lost. The Japanese defensive positions in northern Iwo Jima were unlike anything American forces had encountered in the Pacific War. Kuribayashi had spent months building a network of underground tunnels that connected machine gun nests, artillery positions, and command bunkers. The system was so extensive that entire battalions could move from one end of the island to the other without ever appearing on the surface. More importantly, the Japanese commander had learned from previous Pacific battles. Instead of trying to stop the American landing on the beaches, he had concentrated his defenses inland, where American naval gunfire and air support would be less effective. His plan was to draw American forces into a series of killing grounds, where superior Japanese knowledge of the terrain would offset American advantages in firepower and equipment. Washington's plan for reducing these defenses was methodical and conservative. Advance slowly, using overwhelming firepower to destroy enemy positions one by one, and accept that the campaign might require months to complete. Casualty estimates ranged from 15,000 to 30,000 American killed and wounded. Hartmann's plan was characteristically aggressive. Hit the Japanese defenses so fast, and from so many directions that they couldn't coordinate their response. Instead of reducing enemy positions methodically, he would bypass strongpoints that couldn't be taken quickly and concentrate on seizing key terrain that would collapse the entire defensive system. The advance into northern Iwo Jima began on February 24, with Hartmann's Marines attacking along 3 separate axes simultaneously. The assault was supported by tanks, artillery, and close air support. But the primary weapon was the aggressive spirit that Hartmann had instilled in his troops. The fighting was absolutely savage. Japanese defenders, fighting from positions they had spent months preparing, extracted a terrible price for every yard of volcanic rock. American casualties mounted steadily as Marines advanced through minefields, across open ground swept by machine gun fire, and into cave systems where grenades and flamethrowers were the only effective weapons. But Hartmann's strategy was working. The rapid, multi-directional assault was preventing Japanese forces from concentrating their defenses or coordinating their counterattacks. Enemy positions that had seemed impregnable were falling to Marines who attacked with such speed and violence that defenders didn't have time to organize effective resistance. By March 3, just 2 weeks after the landing, Hartmann's forces had advanced halfway across the island and captured Motoyama Airfield No. 1. The primary objective of the entire campaign, the airfield that was supposed to require weeks of fighting to secure, was in American hands. After 12 days of continuous combat, the messages from Washington were becoming increasingly frantic. Marine Corps headquarters demanded detailed reports on casualties and ammunition expenditure. Navy commanders wanted explanations for why Hartmann was advancing so far ahead of schedule. Joint Chiefs of Staff planners couldn't understand how their careful timetable had been shattered by a colonel who seemed to be fighting an entirely different war. Hartmann's responses were brief and to the point, advancing according to tactical situation, enemy resistance lighter than expected due to rapid assault, casualties acceptable for gains achieved, request additional supplies and reinforcements to exploit success. The truth was that Hartmann's casualties were not light. His regiment had lost nearly 40% of its strength in 2 weeks of fighting, but the gains achieved justified the losses. By advancing rapidly and maintaining constant pressure on Japanese defenders, Hartmann had prevented the enemy from inflicting the much higher casualties that would have resulted from prolonged siege warfare. More importantly, the rapid American advance was beginning to collapse Japanese morale. General Kuribayashi, in his final radio messages to Tokyo, reported that American tactics had completely disrupted his defensive plans. The methodical assault he had prepared to defend against had been replaced by a series of lightning attacks that struck before his forces could respond. The climax of Hartmann's campaign came during the assault on Hill 362A, a strategic height that dominated the approaches to the island's northern coast. The hill was defended by the elite 145th Infantry Regiment, one of the best units in the Japanese army, and had been fortified with concrete bunkers, connecting tunnels, and carefully positioned artillery pieces. Washington's plan called for a week-long bombardment followed by a careful infantry assault supported by tanks and artillery. Casualty estimates for taking the hill ranged from 500 to 1,000 Marines. Killed and wounded, Hartman took the hill in 18 hours, with fewer than 200 casualties. The assault began at midnight on March 8, with 2 companies of Marines climbing the steep northern face of the hill, while a third company created a diversion on the southern slopes. The night attack caught Japanese defenders completely off guard. They had been expecting the standard American pattern of bombardment, followed by daylight assault. By dawn, Marines were fighting inside the Japanese positions on Hill 362A's summit. The close-quarters combat was brutal beyond description, with Americans and Japanese soldiers fighting room to room through bunkers and tunnels carved from solid rock. But the surprise and speed of the assault had shattered Japanese coordination, and individual strongpoints fell quickly to Marines, who had learned to use speed and violence as their primary weapons. The fall of Hill 362A marked the beginning of the end for Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima. With American forces controlling the high ground in the center of the island, Japanese defensive positions could be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Kurabayoshi's carefully prepared defensive system began to collapse as individual positions were overrun faster than reinforcements could be moved to defend them. By March 16, exactly 1 month after the landing, organized Japanese resistance had ended. The battle that was supposed to last months had been won in 4 weeks, through tactics that violated every principle of conventional amphibious warfare. The cost had been enormous. American casualties exceeded 26,000 killed and wounded, with Hartman's regiment suffering particularly heavy losses. But the alternative, prolonged siege that could have lasted through the summer of 1945, would have cost far more American lives and delayed the final assault on Japan by months. The strategic impact of Hartman's victory was immediate and decisive. Iwo Jima's airfields began receiving damaged B-29 bombers within days of the island's capture, saving the lives of hundreds of American airmen. Fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima provided protection for bombing raids on Japan that had previously flown without support. Most importantly, the rapid capture of the island demonstrated American capability to overcome any Japanese defensive position, hastening the end of the war in the Pacific. The personal cost to Hartman was enormous. The colonel, who had disobeyed direct orders and risked everything on his own judgment, was hospitalized with combat exhaustion after the battle ended. The psychological strain of commanding men in continuous combat for a month had pushed even his iron constitution to its limits. But Hartman's tactical innovations had revolutionized American military thinking about amphibious warfare. His emphasis on speed and aggression became standard doctrine for Pacific operations, and his techniques were studied and copied by military leaders around the world. When General Douglas MacArthur visited Iwo Jima in April 1945, he spent 2 hours walking the battlefield with Hartman, discussing the tactics that had won the island so quickly. MacArthur's conclusion was characteristically direct. "Colonel, you fought this battle the way it should have been fought. Speed saved lives." The investigation into Hartman's disobedience of direct orders was quietly dropped after the Joint Chiefs of Staff reviewed the battle reports from Iwo Jima. The colonel who had torn up Washington's orders and risked his career on his own judgment had achieved results that exceeded the most optimistic predictions of Pentagon planners. More importantly, Hartman's victory had demonstrated that aggressive leadership could overcome any obstacle when lives were at stake. His decision to ignore cautious orders and trust his combat experience had saved thousands of American lives and shortened the Pacific War by months. The flag that flew over Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice. But for those who knew the real story, it also represented something else: the courage to make difficult decisions when the lives of others depend on your judgment. Hartman had torn up Washington's orders because he understood that in war, hesitation kills more men than boldness ever does. Today, military academies around the world study Hartman's tactics at Iwo Jima as an example of innovative leadership. Under pressure, his emphasis on speed, surprise, and relentless aggression became the foundation for modern special operations doctrine. Most importantly, his willingness to accept responsibility for decisions that others were afraid to make established a standard for military leadership that continues to inspire commanders facing impossible odds. The man who tore up Washington's orders and captured Iwo Jima in record time had proved that sometimes the most courageous act is to trust your own judgment when lives are at stake. His victory shocked the world, not just because of its speed, but because it demonstrated what was possible when determination and tactical brilliance were combined with the moral courage to do what was right rather than what was safe. In the end, Hartmann's legacy was not just the capture of a strategic island, but the proof that in war, as in life, the greatest victories often come to those who are willing to tear up the script and write their own ending.